So the presentation will go as follows: introduction, objectives, methods, results, and somewhere halfway I will leave to Tor to talk about more the multivariate and spatial analysis and conclusions. So just a little bit of background. The King Street pilot project was implemented in November 12, 2017, and the project reduced traffic volume by 80%, giving priority to streetcar use. This gave a unique opportunity for a study on environmental impacts and transportation network changes. And this study was divided by two components. The first one was the evaluation of air pollution, environmental noise, and travel patterns. And the second component of the study was the public survey to assess perceptions and behavior changes, which is that study that we're going to talk today about and give you the results. Altogether, that gave unique opportunities because it provides a systematic assessment of transportation infrastructure effects on health as mediated through various risk factors. So the objectives of the study were to explore the changes in people perception and use of King Street, also to explore the changes in physical activities, and to explore the changes of people perception on noise pollution, air pollution, and other related traffic hazards. So the survey was an online survey, and it was designed by using reused questions from a previous study that was designed here in University of Toronto from AMR, but we also adopted questions from Canadian Community Health Survey from 2013, as well as from ISO standards of assessment of environmental noise and noise. So the survey was administrated in two different ways. We have 12 questions focused on travel behavior, and people that were intercepted on King Street were able to answer only for one travel mode, depending if they're streetcar users or pedestrians or cyclists. But the people that were recruited at home and in their workplace, they were able to answer for multiple mode of traveling. And I'll just explain a little bit more about that in the next slide. Additional two sections were added to the survey, and the focus of them was user experience and demographics administrated to everyone. We geocoded all responses, and we use residential air pollution and noise pollution in order to visualize, and you will see the results later in that presentation. So just a little bit about the recruitment. It took place from 1st to 15 October 2018, and approximately 7,500 postcards were delivered, and we achieved a sample size of 521 participants. 356 were intercepted, which means they were recruited on King Street, and this happened in peak morning and afternoon hours. Students both from Ryerson University and from University of Toronto were personally delivering postcards to users of King Street, and depending if they were cycling, using the streetcar, or walking, they answered the question for that particular travel mode. We had 165 participants who were recruited at home and in their workplace on King Street and in surrounded neighborhood. And this happened again, students were dropping off postcards in mailboxes and on front desk of business and residential buildings. So just to point out, the total responses is higher for those that were recruited at home and in workplace than the total participants. And this is, again, as I mentioned, because they were able to answer for multiple mode of traveling, which means if they use 2 times per week streetcar, then they responded to these questions. But if for the rest of the week they walk, then they answer the questions for pedestrian. So 50% of the sample was in the age between 25 and 44. There was an equal distribution of female and male participants, and 56% of the participants were homeowners. So in the next part of the presentation, we'll talk about the results from the 12 questions of travel behavior. When evaluating the frequency of travel on King Street, more than 50% of the full sample reported walking on King Street 5 days or more per week, and 64% of streetcar users that were intercepted on King Street were also using 5+ more days a week. But here on this graph, we see that there is a bit more variability for the people, for the responses of people who are recruited at home and in their workplace. The primary purpose of the trip was for majority of the participants was to commute to work or school. But again, among the participants that were recruited at home and their workplace, we have a higher frequency for shopping and entertainment. Change in frequency of streetcar use or walking. We could see that for both samples for streetcar users and for pedestrians, there is, well, for streetcar users, there's an increase of use of streetcar. For pedestrians, the majority say there is no change, but we still have more than 20% that increase their walking on King Street after the implementation of the King Street pilot project. Change in the duration and length of physical activities for the most common trip, which physical activities we mean cycling and walking. And just to orient you, here on the left side are residents and employers on King Street, and on the right side is intercepted people on King Street. On the top it's streetcar users, and down pedestrian. The majority of participants responded that there is no change of the duration and length of physical activities, but the data suggests that there is a decrease of physical activities for about subsamples of streetcar users, which was an interesting outcome. But change in mode of traveling, very little change among pedestrians. Higher proportion of change among, again, home and workplace participants compared to intercepts for streetcar use. We see that there is an equal distribution of change of mode. So around 10% people used to drive a car and now they use the streetcar, or they used to walk and now they use the streetcar, which may be related with the responses we got from the previous question I showed you. And also some switched TTC, which further question that is not, we didn't put in that presentation, but we know that there is a high proportion of people that change from using a Queen Street streetcar to King Street streetcar. So the next part, we'll see the results from the user experience and perceptions questions. Increased likelihood of activities on King Street. There is an increased likelihood of walking regardless of the purpose of walking. There is a higher variability of responses for cyclists, and definitely increased likelihood of shopping and entertainment on King Street after the implementation of the project. Change in noise and noise in King Street. We asked the question if people felt annoyed or disturbed by noise before and after the transit pilot. In yellow we see before, and in blue after. And a big, I guess, difference is in the responses of very and extremely, which before the pilot project, there were around 30% that responded being very and extremely annoyed by noise, which after the pilot dropped to 6%. And another drastic change is in the responses of not at all annoyed, which we see that before the transit pilot, there were around 20% responding not at all annoyed from traffic noise. But after the pilot, this increased with 30% reaching more than 50% of the participants reported being not at all annoyed from traffic noise. Strong and positive perceptions of King Street experience. we see both for pedestrians and streetcar users, there is a strong agreement of positive experience on King Street after the project was implemented. More than half of the sample reported feeling much more safe after the King Street implementation. And improved perception of King Street. For all characteristics of King Street, 50% and more agree or strongly agree that there is improvement, with a higher percent of strong agreement in transit system, followed by public space. But here we could see that there's more than 50% of the participants responded agree and strongly agree of improved air quality and noise, which answer our objectives, if you remember from previously from the presentation. And I will leave here to Tor to talk about more about the multivariate analysis.
Thanks. So, in large part, this whole project was initiated to support the City of Toronto Transportation Services and in collaboration with Toronto Public Health. This first part that Desi just described is making its way through and hopefully informing the decision making on continuing whether or not to continue this pilot study, which, based on what we have looked at so far, seems to be pretty strong evidence for that. There's very positive responses to the environment, increases in streetcar use, increases in walkability or walking among streetcar users. So those are sort of the sort of simple results that do provide some fairly good evidence for this pilot being successful. But we are, of course, also interested in some of the relationships between factors and how different characteristics of perhaps respondents actually influence why they chose to walk or use the transit system more. So this is where, as Desi mentioned, we have gone a bit beyond the initial goal of this to look at some of the spatial characteristics of the sample as well as the environment to see how that influenced this. This is fairly hot off the press, so preliminary results, I guess you can say. I don't actually have any results regarding air pollution and noise exposure of the respondents, but we're definitely interested in exploring that more to see if there are, depending on perhaps the exposure levels at home, whether that influences how you responded to changes on King Street. But this basically just shows where respondents in the sample were living at the time, and as probably expected, pretty high concentration of them around the King Street study area, and then throughout the downtown and farther away you go, that obviously decreases. So not a huge sample, but I think we can say this is a fair representation of where people that use King Street transit system reside in the city. So among the two characteristics or influences of the pilot that we're particularly interested in were changes in transit use and walking and physical activity, which Desi already mentioned. So this idea of frequency of transit use versus perception of transit use was kind of interesting. So of course, the idea again with the pilot was to increase the speeds of the transit system across the study area. So knowing that we saw a quite notably or significant increase in the number of people that reported using the transit system, what were some of the characteristics that influenced that? So again, this is then just only among the people who reported taking the streetcar or were either intercepted taking the streetcar or reported using the streetcar at home, while everyone in the entire sample responded to this. So this is probably a more holistic, obviously perceptual understanding of it, but again includes everyone in the entire sample. So a few demographic influences, differences are one in the younger and one in the older age category, but both nonetheless seem to suggest that a younger population were more likely to respond to the changes. Males among people that reported that were on the streetcar or reporting using the streetcar were twice as likely as females to increase the frequency. That's not something that corresponds a lot with literature, so I'm not sure where that comes from. But probably, as you would expect, people that live more closer to the King Street pilot, 2 to 3 times more likely to actually use or perceive the use of the transit system more. And most notably, then really strong effects of traffic safety change or perceived changes in safety from traffic where those that reported using the streetcar were six times more likely, or sorry, those who reported using the streetcar more were 6 times more likely to perceive traffic safety as much higher. And for the whole sample, 12 times higher perceptions of safety among those that thought the transit pilot increased their likelihood of use of the transit system.
So for the odds ratios there, so some of them I'm getting, but maybe the rest, could you explain, so traffic safety change, those are what are the two groups being compared there?
Basically those that thought there was strong or notable or strong, I forget what the wording was, moderate or strong change in a moderate or significant change in traffic safety, basically. So there was 5 categories from negative, strongly negative, neutral, positive or strongly positive to traffic change. So these were individuals that were positive or strongly positive in response to that question of traffic safety change. So basically
the ones that were weak responses.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the more positively we viewed safety as improving, the more likely you were to use the transit or perceive transit as being better. So the same counts for walking, but perhaps somewhat surprisingly not such a strong effect of safety perceptions here. So for actual people that again were intercepted while walking or reported walking regularly on King Street, while people that perceived either commuting or perceived walking for leisure as more likely because of the pilot, again 2 to 3 times more likely to be walking more based on having this positive view of traffic safety change. What's interesting here for us that are in air pollution and noise, we're doing a lot of work on that, our perceptions of those environmental exposures. So interestingly, only air quality perceptions among the sample that actually reported walking on King Street seemed to influence it. So people that responded to thinking there was a significant improvement in air quality were almost four times more likely to report increased frequency of walking, while for the perception of increased or improved walkability, I guess you could say, air quality, noise, and public space perceptions, so positive perceptions of those corresponded to positive views on increased likelihood of walking on King Street. And then finally, perhaps not surprisingly, some predictions among the sample then on these traffic safety responses, so odds ratios for whether or not you thought traffic safety had improved moderately or significantly, air quality, public space, and levels of noise annoyance all very much predicted that. So you can see that there's obviously some kind of a joined view or joined perception of these things. They go together. So when people perceive improved safety, maybe that's a consequence of decreased noise levels, because that's a signal, obviously, that there's less traffic around you that you should be worried about. So in conclusion, we did see, so one of the key objectives was to understand if this type of public or built environment intervention has an influence on physical activity, and we actually saw potentially a decreased level of physical activity among streetcar users particularly, but at the same time increased likelihood and frequencies of walking. So we don't really have the question, we didn't think of this perhaps beforehand, so the questionnaire wasn't designed to actually be able to sort of measure minute for minute whether the decreased physical activity from streetcar convenience was outweighed by more walking in the other sample, but nonetheless, very notable and positive impacts of the pilot study on user experience in all aspects of it, where there was improved likelihood of using the transit system, more positive perception of the public space, improved quality of life generally, road safety, noise, and air quality. And while we didn't yet, or perhaps just due to the challenges of joining these types of data sets, know if noise exposures correspond to perceptions of noise in the sample or air quality for that matter, there was a notably a significant decrease in noise levels along King Street due to this this pilot study, and the responses that we get in the survey seem to suggest that people responded to that. And I guess in conclusion, this feature or this characteristic of perceived traffic safety seems to be a central one that maybe ties together all these different environmental perceptions, and actually is how people conceptualize environmental quality overall, and whether or not they choose to change their travel behaviors in an environment like this. So just to draw on or compare this to the literature that it kind of fits in, relatively recent, 2012, very comprehensive review of effects of built environment interventions on physical activity that was done for the specific context of Ontario, did find that traffic calming and street aesthetics can increase physical activity, but with more direct relevance to our project. They actually said that transportation and travel policies and practices which focus on improving pedestrian transit and light rail access to increase pedestrian and cyclist activity and safety, very much what the pilot study sought to do, reduce car use and improve air quality, have not changed physical activity behavior. So we are perhaps with this study adding to this body of literature that doesn't really give us a clear answer on how these types of interventions in built environments actually change physical activity levels. There's lots of studies. There's a large body of literature from building on perhaps this obesogenic environment study area. So 15, 20 years ago, there's a recognition that obesity was a significant health problem. That in turn led to a lot of more focus on physical activity and environmental influences on those. So we can say that this literature that we look at today, looking at built environment physical activity, in large part came from this idea of obesogenic environments. But what sort of can't be separated from that literature are actually other neighborhood or vulnerability or disadvantaged socioeconomic characteristics that go along with that. So in an environment like the King Street pilot study, where perhaps it's not really crossing that much of a diversity of types of neighborhood and people that are involved, maybe that whole physical activity and built environment literature doesn't necessarily translate. Walkability as well is another area of research that would suggest if you entice or improve the conditions for physical activity and environment, then people should walk more. We know that very clearly. But the King Street area, you can argue, was actually a very walkable neighborhood previously. It's a very dense, things like intersection density, mixed lane use. These are characteristics that we normally predict walkability with, and those things already exist on King Street. Although we saw increased walking on the street itself, the entire area, compared to a suburban region, would be considered very highly walkable with or without the pilot study. And then finally, as I touched on, this idea of risk perception and safety, there's quite a bit of work that's been done on sort of understanding risk perceptions and how people take these, how people formulate these or how they conceptualize these, and sort of going from a very quantitative, which we call the psychometric paradigm of risk perception, to a more recent, what we call the sociocultural theory of risk perception. We know that people very much place their understanding of risk and environment and how they behave in it based on the place. So how they relate to a place, again, becomes very context dependent and individual. And for those of us to do a lot more work on sort of air quality modeling and more less human behavior and perception related topics, I guess this challenges the sort of objective or generalization of these types of studies. So I think all these are good things to think about in doing this kind of work, but also make it kind of challenging. Now, that being said, it's definitely it's an important type of project, understanding how these built environment interventions influence mobility of people and health overall, maybe not just physical activity, but exposure to environmental hazards. Certainly important, but perhaps in some cases, especially when We distributed almost 8,000 postcards and only got 500 people to complete the survey. Obviously it's difficult to recruit people to be in studies at the best of times. I don't think a lot of these types of studies end up having a huge sample size, so that's where this idea of mixed methods can be important and come in and sort of supplement our understanding or the narratives, I guess, that people use to understand or react to the environment. Another set or type of study that can sort of complement or maybe be considered or be used more effectively in the future when we come across or when these types of interventions are planned, or simulation or policy scenario studies. So we do, we have a good understanding of the relationships between air quality, noise and health and exposure, transit, walkability. We know some of these relationships, so that it's not necessarily going beyond what we should be to use those to predict what's going to happen before decisions are made, which is exactly what the simulation and policy scenario type of studies do. So Toronto Public Health actually developed something called the Health Enhanced Land Use Planning software tool some years ago. Not sure how much it's being utilized right now, but that was the idea of that, was basically to allow simulation. What happens when you change these land use characteristics? What happens to potential health outcomes that are related to that? Another area which is developing quickly as we speak, and I'm actually a part of, is when we integrate urban models or transportation and land use models with health and health modeling and simulation outcomes, we can actually get very detailed down to the sort of nitty-gritty of how a city works from a systems perspective and predict how people's health will respond to changes in the built environment. Beyond those sort of potential methodological applications, there's definitely a need and incentives to continue this type of work, quite effectively demonstrated, I think, by the Chief Public Health Officer in Canada a couple of years ago, choosing to, when they give their yearly statement or yearly report, she called it Designing Healthy Living, and sort of put out a call to action on very much this topic of understanding how built environment and health interact. So some of the calls to actions she mentioned were evaluate the health impacts of community design features, strengthen existing approaches, and collaborate to collect standardized data and engage citizens. So I would say, in this study overall, I didn't really discuss the noise monitoring or modeling, as well as the air quality monitoring or modeling. There's also mobility modeling that was sort of a part of this entire project that were obviously not discussed here, but I think we checked off these three in one way or another, but there's certainly incentive to continue doing these types of studies into the future. So that's all I had. If you have any questions.